if conservatives are going to spare Jewish studies, is there going to be an expectation then that Jewish studies itself become more conservative? Because we don't actually want to spare a department of left-wing academics just because they happen to be Jewish or studying Jews. We want to spare an academic department that is part of our, political movement, or is it aligned with us politically?
Hi, I'm Phoebe Maltz Bovy, and you're listening to The Jewish Angle, a podcast from the Canadian Jewish News. There's many headlines from The Onion, the satirical newspaper, that have stuck with me over the years, but there's one that I'm particularly fond of, and it goes like this. Man finally put in charge of struggling feminist movement. I was reminded of this headline when I was reading Arno Rosenfeld's reporting in the foreword and background extras in his Substack newsletter, Anti-Semitism Decoded, about the story of a non-Jewish German man named Günther Jikeli taking over as head of Indiana University's Jewish Studies program at the same time as the then head, who is Jewish, was ousted to make way. There is much, much more to this story. That is not the whole thing, but there is a kind of snappy version that is a bit reminiscent of that Onion headline, which is definitely why I clicked. But there is much more to it, which is why today I'm so happy to have Arno Rosenfeld on The Jewish Angle. Welcome, Arno.
Thanks so much for having me.
And welcome back, I should say, because I think we talked on Bonjour Kai. Is that correct?
Yeah, a couple of years ago.
Yeah. And so nothing's happened, though, right? Would you say in the Jewish world in those
I've
years?
just been sitting around waiting to come back on. Yeah, spinning my wheels.
So let's just start with the kind of big picture. What happened at Indiana University such that I am asking you about it on a Canadian Jewish podcast?
Yeah, it's a great question because I periodically get tips about academic bureaucracy. And, professors on campuses obviously are very invested on whatever is happening on their campus. And a lot of times I'm like, okay, 12 professors signed a letter at some school about something. It's not gonna translate for readers. But what happened at Indiana? So Indiana University, it's in the Midwest, but it has a really significant Jewish studies program and a really large Jewish student body, given that it's not one of these schools in a traditionally Jewish center.
That's
So it has
surprising. You said it's the sixth. You said the sixth largest
Right,
Jewish
I think
population. Yeah.
I believe that's in, like, sheer number of students because it's a big state school, and it has a pretty substantial, Jewish population. Yeah, big Hillel, big Chabad, etcetera, and one of the things that it has is a big Jewish studies program that was founded in the '70s. It was one of the big, first big programs not in one of these coastal centers, and there was a guy who was running the program, Mark Roseman, this British Jewish Holocaust historian, not a terribly political guy. He'd run it for like 8 out of the last 12 years, I believe, as director of the program. And over the summer, he was summarily removed without explanation from the place atop this program. And he was replaced by this guy who was associate director of Indiana's Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism, named Günther Jikeli, as you mentioned. And he was both Roseman was removed in an unusual way, without explanation given, and Jikeli was installed as interim. He is interim, in a relatively unusual way, and then quickly went about. So some people were just upset about that. They were upset that this was done in an unprecedented, sort of way. Which again, I was like, okay, but this is academic bureaucracy. But once he took over, he moved pretty quickly to institute some sort of hardline policies, and specifically he clashed with a graduate student, an anti-Zionist graduate student, but it sort of transcended maybe that personal spat that the two of them had, and people started worrying that he was going to infringe on the academic freedom of people who did not embrace his sort of more pro-Israel Zionist worldview, and that's what drew my attention to the story.
What's so interesting about this, apart from everything, is that the Jewish professor who was so suddenly, so abruptly replaced. So you're just to reiterate, it's not that he himself was like out there in the encampments in a keffiyeh and so forth at all. It seems it's much more subtle. It's more that he was replaced by somebody who is, although he denies this, activist in the other direction.
Right, right. No, I mean, that is what was so interesting because there have certainly been cases where you have a leftist Jewish academic that generates some kind of backlash. And, we can talk about the implications of that, but at least it's sort of intelligible. You look at it and you're like, yeah, okay, well, they were courting controversy in some sense, and then controversy came. But, Mark Roseman, his big project, he was just finishing like in a 4 volume, 8 volume, some doorstopper history of the Holocaust. He was not at the encampments. He was not, front and center online with his political views. And honestly, the people I talked to on kind of both sides of the debate at Indiana, none of them had anything bad to say about him personally. The people who like Jikeli were just sort of like, oh yeah, it's weird. The school should have told us why they got rid of him. So no one was really rooting for his removal publicly, at least.
Yeah, I mean, there's another aspect of this. The wildest part of the story to me, sort of almost defies political interpretation because it's where a student protester, who I take it from, I would guess is Jewish, but I don't know if you say, tries to sign up for Jikeli's course. Jikeli counter proposes independent study, and then there's a lecture announced at the Virginia Psychoanalytic Society with the title "In the Mind of a Pro-Hamas Student," and then the description you write is based on a semester-long dialogue with a pro-Hamas campus activist. There's that, which he then changes the title and, like, because the student complains, and then,
Yeah.
there's another thing where he uses this, pro-Palestinian, part Muslim, part Jewish student's Free Palestine avatar in his undergraduate course. To me, these seem like whatever your politics, and I think my politics are probably closer to Ukele's than to that of these students.
Sure.
I am like, "What is going on here?" Because
Right,
this
it's
just
it's
seems.
it's sort of this
Yeah.
melding of politics and academia in a way that is not terribly uncommon. I mean, professors do the independent study thing is wild, and we can talk a little bit more about that. But
Please,
it's
because
not.
'cause I'm very obsessed with this.
Yeah, but it was really striking, both instances, and they suggest that he's sort of, comfortable melding, or doesn't necessarily see these 2 things, his sort of pro-Israel orientation and his academic research as, distinct or as needing to be, separated in the way that we typically think of in the American, higher education system. The independent study thing, so I don't believe that the student, was Jewish, at least that didn't come up as part of how he described himself. But yeah, the student, Jekeli was known on campus as a pro-Israel professor. He had organized this rally against Hamas propaganda during the encampments, which he insisted to me was not a pro-Israel event. There were people there with Israeli flags. And so, one of these student activists wanted to take a class that he taught. I think it was about Israel and social media, and he signed up. But Jekeli basically removed him from the class, unregistered him, and said, "Oh, you're a graduate student. You're too knowledgeable about this stuff. But let's meet. You and I can meet, and we'll do our own independent study." And the student said it went pretty well. I mean, the student seemed like a pretty earnest guy. I was like, I like debating. Like, I figured it would be fun. It's a good way to hone your ideas. I might learn something. And he said it was very cordial. They met once a week throughout the course of the semester. Then they kept emailing after the semester was over. He was kind of critical of Jekeli in ways that would make sense given their biases. But he said, he actually thought that Jekeli didn't know as much as he should have, given how he kind of positioned himself. In any event, yes. So they sort of have this falling out over email, and then some weeks later, he sees Jekeli promoting this lecture about going inside of the mind of a Hamas student, and the tagline, the original tagline on the promotional material said, that the talk was based on a semester long dialogue with a student. And so it seemed very obvious that he was referring to this independent study with the student. He, of course, denied that, and he said, no, it was about these other things. I had conversations with people at encampments. It was based on social media. And the talk that he ultimately delivered after, I believe, 2, departmental deans and directors reached out and said sort of like, hey, like, you can't do, if you wanted to do research on a student, there are disclosures they have to sign. And it's like there's a whole system of approval has to go through. So he basically did not deliver a talk about the student. And he maintains that he was never going to deliver a talk about the student. But yes, really, like, it was shocking to me. It's like, it's not a thing that a professor does. And then, yeah, the thing in the classroom was basically that he'd removed. So one of the early things that happened after he took over as director of the program was that he removed a student from a hybrid in-person and online event because she had an avatar, the picture that displays when your camera's turned off on Zoom, that had a photo of or an illustration of a woman wearing a keffiyeh around her face, basically Palestinian flag background. It said "Free Palestine." Um, and he said, this is creating a hostile learning environment, removed the student, then sent an email to the department saying that she had been displaying a photo of a Palestinian terrorist. And just to clarify, the illustration was of like a fictional, it was not a, because at first I thought there have been some like silhouettes of famous, Palestinian terrorist slash resistance figures. It wasn't that. It was just a generic illustration. Anyway, he gets called into this meeting, or they organize a meeting between the leaders of the Jewish Student Graduate Association and the dean of the humanities, and Jikeli is in there. And the dean is sort of saying like, well, there are these free speech concerns. And Jikeli says, well, I took the photo that everyone's upset about, and I showed it to one of my undergraduate classrooms, and I asked them, and the assignment in the class is hyper specific. It says, if this Zoom avatar was displayed during a hybrid in-person meeting with professors and faculty and students, would you feel that this was an unsafe learning environment? And he says basically, well, I can't share the actual responses because that would violate privacy, but I'll just tell you, the students were very uncomfortable with this image. Therefore, I'm justified. And the dean was kind of like, this school has policies. We have to uphold the First Amendment, etc. And Jikeli says, I got a recording of this meeting, so this wasn't public. But Jikeli says, you need to tell me if you're not going to allow me to keep banning the student, because if you don't allow me to keep banning the student, people are going to consider that a Title VI, a federal civil rights violation, and I'm not going to tolerate that. With the implication being that there were people who would file a federal complaint against Indiana if the dean didn't allow Jikeli to keep running the department the way that he wanted to, all of which was pretty unusual, shocking.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like, I am not a Middle East expert. I have a doctorate. It's adjacent to Jewish studies. It has nothing to do with the Middle East. It's all about France and 19th century France prior to the state of Israel even existing. Um, I am somewhat expert, I would say, just from my life and like what's normal in academia and not. And
Yeah.
like, and also I have much stronger feelings and sort of less nuanced and ambiguous, or not ambiguous, like ambivalent feelings about professors. Sort of like there's a lot in the news always about like if a professor hits on a student or something, there's some kind of like
Right.
Me Too angle. This is something else, but I think it's also very important. It's less of a like sexy topic, but like I've never liked it when professors involve themselves in student affairs in a certain way, whatever it is, like if it's in the olden days, if a professor would like blog about something in the student newspaper or like write it for the New York Times, something in their own school newspaper, or like try to get sort of viral content from something that happened in class, whatever the politics of it. This is something that I've always despised. And this just seems like such an instance. It like if, yeah, I don't know exactly what went down, but that does not seem like that seems problematic, like separate from anything to do with the politics. And we are going to talk about the politics and the other aspects of it, but that just I want to like start with because that's just concerning, and I don't think helpful to the political side that it's ostensibly on. Um, but I want to talk about the academia sort of setting of all of this because it's been my perception anecdotally that Jewish studies scholars are both mainly Jewish and also to the left of Jews in the general population, much like academics in Canada and in the United States are to the left of the general population. Is there data on who the professors of Jewish studies are, either demographically or politically? Like how many are Jewish and what their politics are?
I'm not familiar with specific data in the U.S. There may be something out there, but certainly I think it is true that most Jewish studies faculty are Jewish. I think a lot are not terribly political one way or the other. We hear about the ones who are, especially in relation to Israel, are to the left. Certainly, most university professors in the U.S. We know are generally liberal, like on when it comes to Democratic versus Republican. But a lot of Jewish studies professors are studying medieval Jewish history. They're studying, Yiddish culture in Europe. They're studying things that are not terribly political. But yes, I mean, when it comes to the debates, especially over anti-Semitism in Israel, which was a big thing in this story and a big thing in the news in the last few years, it is the professors that give the backing to the most sort of like left wing interpretations of these things. So you typically see the Jewish establishment organizations in the United States, the Jewish federations, the Anti Defamation League, etc., with more conservative understandings of the line between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism, and then the Jerusalem Declaration, for example, which is the most progressive version of this, was endorsed by like hundreds of mostly Jewish studies and Holocaust studies faculty. And so yeah, that's certainly true. And there's, we can talk too about this kind of transition that we've seen since the early 2000s, the rise and fall of Israel studies. It sort of feeds into this more recent
That was going to be
anti-Semitism
my
studies thing.
next
But yeah,
question. Absolutely. Yeah, and I think it's a good point you make about federations and organizations like this being, and especially this is true, I think, more so maybe in the States than in Canada, although it's hard to say, being to the right of the Jewish population at large. So you have, on the one hand, academia, like the Jews who are Jewish studies professors, may be further to the left, but then there are these other, like, so there are two types of organized entities that kind of seem to be mouthpieces for the community that both are not quite representative politically. Although I guess obviously not mouthpieces, Jewish studies academics is a little different. I just my When I say anecdotally, like friends and acquaintances who or like my mutuals on social media are the people who I know who are posting very critical of Israel content and
yeah,
thoughtful content. But like those are the people I know who do that. But the most, and I have a lot of Jewish friends and acquaintances who just couldn't care less about the topic and are posting
yeah.
like something else. But I wanted to talk though about this Israel studies and anti-Semitism studies sort of history from recent years, because what you write about is it seems like philanthropists had certain hopes for Israel studies. So that was like a subset of Jewish studies that you were saying is relatively new. And how did their hopes diverge from the reality?
Yeah, so, in the early 2000s, following the Second Intifada, that was sort of around the rise of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement against Israel. And there was a lot of, activism targeting Israel on college campuses. And in addition to funding, professionals who could help organize pro Israel students and, funding programs at Hillel and whatnot, there was also this sense that, like, we should get experts on Israel to come to, be hired by these campuses as faculty, and they will sort of be advocates for the pro-Israel side. I think some of it was sort of narrowly cynical, like in those terms, like we're going to hire, 10 Israel studies professors, and they're going to like be on the front lines of protests defending Israel. And then I think some of it was earnest. It was just a sense of like the kids don't get it, and so we're going to hire people to teach courses on Israel because there's not going to be one if we don't hire people to do it, or they're going to be coming out of the Middle Eastern studies departments, which are historically much more pro-Palestinian. And so these chairs began getting endowed, and these programs began getting endowed in Israel studies. And this was basically a new field. So actually, a lot of the early hires were Israeli academics who'd been teaching this in Israel. But of course, the Israeli academics who want to come teach about Israel on American college campuses were by and large, left wing Israelis, basically. And then, you started getting more American, again, mostly Jewish academics to take these roles. But, a lot of them were quite critical of Israel, in part because most academia involves some sort of critical perspective, right? No one really just writes a dissertation on how something is really great and cool. You're looking to pick apart some part of the history and really dive in. And so what these donors discovered after, a decade or so was like, oh, I'm paying for a professor who's actually giving, you know, perhaps at best a very nuanced, kind of critical lens on Israel. And at worst, they're teaching about how the origins of Zionism were racist, or they're teaching about ethnic cleansing in mandatory Palestine or something. And so they were like, oh, I guess this is not a way to help pro-Israel students, stand up for themselves on campus. And so, funding has dried up in some cases. There have been a few specific controversies about people trying to pull existing donations. But essentially, they determined that that had not worked as a strategy.
Well, I wanted to just kind of continue on the theme of Israel studies and the hopes for it and so forth, because you were saying that you would expect that an academic discipline would involve critical interpretations and so forth. I take your point, but at the same time, when you think about all the fields that are so detested by the MAGA type, and even pre that, just conservative critics of higher ed in the States and elsewhere who really are like, Africana studies, Asian studies, women's studies, gender studies, all of this. These are disciplines that have come under criticism for being, and to some extent have been activist aligned in terms of, being
Totally. Yeah.
about promoting and defending the group in question. So I think that what's interesting here is that Israel studies did not play out like that. This was almost more like masculinity studies or whiteness studies. You know what I mean? Like, I think there was this, and this gets to these sort of like huge questions about whether Jews perceive themselves, certainly Jews in academia are perceiving themselves as oppressor or oppressed, and in which combination. Because I think the mere fact of Israel studies existing, you wouldn't necessarily think it would consist of people being critical of it. You might think it is people doing as in these other studies programs, defending and like,
Yeah, I mean, I think the distinction is that, and this, ties into this pivot toward anti-Semitism studies. But Israel studies, and I'm not an expert in academia and academic fields, but it was sort of like regional studies, right? And so the fields you're talking about are kind of ethnic studies, where yes, there's some sense that you're on the side of the group that you are studying. But if you look at those, it's not that, like, women's studies are just. I mean, I'm sure this happens, but that those academics are just writing things that say, oh, women are really great. It's like you're looking at, okay, well, what are the forces in society that are perhaps discriminating against, this vulnerable group? And same with some of the other ethnic studies departments. Whereas Israel studies, it's like you're studying a country and a region. And so the dynamic is just a little bit different. In fact, Jewish studies is probably closer to Africana studies and Asian studies and all of these other things, when it comes to that. And certainly scholars of Jewish studies are not, for the most part, being critical of Jews in the sense of like picking apart how Jews are actually problematic in this way or that way. Like, I would say
yeah.
Jewish studies faculty are historically, much more clearly kind of on the side, if you want to look at it that way, of Jews. But then people who just study the Middle East, it's like you're looking at political actors and historical forces that are shaping the region. And so I think it just didn't lend itself to that model. And then there's also just the fact that, yeah, I mean, academia skews left wing, and so just because you create a new field doesn't mean it's suddenly going to materialize a bunch of scholars who break with the sort of like academic mainstream and take a more perhaps conservative approach.
Ever since October 7th, 2023, Muslim and Jewish communities in Canada have been torn apart.
I've known you for 20 years. You've been at my house for Shabbat supper, I don't know how many times. And for 1 second, you can't put down your friend and just hold my hand?
We're fed a constant stream of Jews and Muslims talking at each other, about each other, but rarely do we hear them talking to each other.
There was, why are you doing this? What's the benefit of doing this?
This podcast aims to do something different. I'm Avi Feingold, a rabbi and a writer with the Canadian Jewish News.
I'm Yafa Sakeja, a Canadian Palestinian entrepreneur and volunteer with the Canadian Friends of Standing Together.
We're sitting down with Jews and Muslims, Israelis and Palestinians from coast to coast and across the political divide, having difficult conversations in good faith.
We are not the Israeli government. Palestinians are not Hamas.
This is the place where we're both supposed to end up, Israeli and Palestinian, Arab and Jewish.
Subscribe to In Good Faith, wherever you listen to podcasts.
And I want to talk now about this anti-Semitism studies area, because it's interesting to me. It seems like it's not really like who would do this. It's not clear to me that this is even like a part of Jewish studies. To me, this seems like, I almost was wondering, and this may be a little bit like galaxy brained on my part, but German non-Jews might be the very people who would be. That's not surprising that they would be, well situated to be experts in the study of anti-Semitism. And I do see a value separate from anything that's going on in this case with this professor who seems interesting, um, in having there be more in-depth study of anti-Semitism, of the history of anti-Semitism, of the dynamics of anti-Semitism, of how it operates. It seems like maybe like we'll get back to the question of like how this came about and so forth and why there is anti-Semitism
Sure.
studies and all this. But is the problem maybe just that like the zero sum aspect, the idea that this should be replacing traditional Jewish studies as opposed to that this is an inherently useless field. Like it's new, but it seems to me like new but useful potentially.
Yeah, I think that that's right. I mean, certainly I'm very interested in anti-Semitism, and there has been a dearth of research. I mean, Pamela Nidell just came out with a book about this, or it's forthcoming, but about the history of anti-Semitism in the United States. Prior to that, the last book looking at, the history of anti-Semitism in the United States came out in the mid 90s. There just hasn't been very much academic research on, anti-Semitism as such. And where it came up in Jewish studies, it was largely around the Holocaust or historic persecution of Jews or isolated studies about stuff going on in the US. So yes, I think in the abstract, more study of anti-Semitism is fantastic. I think in practice, it is often, the rise of anti-Semitism studies. It's very big in Europe, in Germany. It's also big in Israel. And then there have been these various attempts to have it take off in the United States, going back, I think about 15 years. One of the issues is that it has often sort of translated to when people talk about the study of contemporary anti-Semitism, especially, they're talking about anti-Zionism and criticism of Israel. And so the kind of conception of anti-Semitism is almost a little bit predetermined. So that we want to fund this institute, or we want to fund this, chair or the study or whatever, to basically look at how pro-Palestinian activists are anti-Semitic, which again is not necessarily incorrect. Of course, there's anti-Semitism in all sorts of political movements. There's certainly anti-Semitism in relation to Israel, but it is kind of politicized from the start in a way that I think is tricky to then have operate in the way that a normal academic discipline or field would operate.
Well, I think it's tricky. I mean, I'm coming at this again like from a background of where I did do a doctorate and taught as an adjunct a little after, and like I think it was the case. I think it's probably changed a bit, you know, in the States that like there was a lot of crossover between humanities or social sciences, sort of academia and left wing. Like there was just such a norm that everybody was to the left that if you expressed even
Yeah,
like a center left view, that was a bit like I could startle people with like very, very mundane views and
sure.
and I'm a Democrat and whatever. Like um but what's interesting about this is like this is an activist identity group studies program at a time when those are otherwise being kind of um gotten rid of. You know what I mean? Like that's an interesting sort of twist to it.
Well, the really interesting thing is anti-Semitism studies in the way that I've described it. Of course, there are a lot of people who study anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitism studies as such is what you're kind of describing, and it is to the right of Jewish studies, existing Jewish studies, and so Jewish studies as a sort of field has been spared these DEI cuts up to now. At least it has been sort of carved out when the Trump administration cracks down on DEI, when Republican state legislatures, as exist in Indiana, crack down on ethnic studies programs and sort of these ideas of we have all these worthless departments, they're worthless degrees, they're just leftist academics. Jewish studies is being spared from that. But most of Jewish studies is to the right of like other ethnic studies, but only by like a little bit. Like it's generally not a radical academic department. But they're liberal, left wing, faculty studying in those departments. But anti-Semitism studies is, much more to the right of ethnic studies and often like directly at odds with them, like often blaming sort of various minority groups for anti-Semitism. And so the question, and something that jumped out to me at Indiana, was this question of like, okay, if conservatives are going to spare Jewish studies, is there going to be an expectation then that Jewish studies itself become more conservative? Because we don't actually want to spare a department of left-wing academics just because they happen to be Jewish or studying Jews. We want to spare an academic department that is part of our, political movement, or is it aligned with us politically? And, and so that's where anti-Semitism studies, as a much more like openly pro-Israel discipline, can sort of step in and take some leadership over the field of Jewish studies and say, oh, we're actually aligned with, the people who are very skeptical of Africana studies, who are skeptical of gender studies, who are skeptical of Middle Eastern studies. And so I think that, that hasn't fully happened yet at all. But I'm curious whether what we saw at Indiana is maybe a little preview of things to come in that area.
I have time for one more question, I think. And it's one that's very important because I think it gets to kind of like the core of what your reporting is and isn't in terms of the takeaways. So
Sure.
as it happens, Jikeli is not Jewish. And as it happens, it seems that he came to his views via this strange path that everybody should read Arno Rosenfeld read you on about this very specific German story
Yeah.
of it's fascinating, and I would not do it justice here, but basically like guilt turning into a kind of strange anti-Semitism that Jews often find strange. That doesn't always line up with how Jews themselves feel. Like it's interesting. Anyway, and his own personal judgment, from what you have reported, does not sound impeccable. Whose is? His evidently is not. Anyway, there are plenty of Jews who do share his politics, and as
Right.
you report,
Yeah.
who are among his boosters. When I was in college and grad school, there would be non-Jews in my Jewish studies or Hebrew language classes, and
Yeah.
everybody was always very positive about this. And it was clear that this was academia. This was not Hebrew school. This was not like learning to be a Jew. This was something different. This was an academic discipline. It's certainly ironic and makes for like a funny twist, like Jewish professor removed, German non-Jewish professor put in his place. Does it ultimately matter for the story that he's not Jewish, or is that just kind of like what makes it a little funny?
Yeah, it's a good question. And this came up in my reporting. I mean, in Germany, there is a lot of Jewish studies, and the non-Jews who participate in it is largely a non-Jewish discipline because there just aren't that many Jews in Germany these days. And it's been used by both sides. So a few years ago, there was a controversy, I believe, at the Moses Mendelssohn Institute, where there were left-wing non-Jews or more liberal non-Jews staffing this program, and sort of pro-Israel Jews came out and said, look, can you believe they're letting a bunch of non-Jewish Germans, tell us what is and isn't anti-Semitism on the other side. And so I don't think that the fact that someone is not Jewish predetermines their political orientation or anything like that on these issues. And in fact, it's often the opposite. It's often that we would prefer to have someone, Jewish in one of these roles because they really get it and they understand why Israel is important to Jews. So the reason why I think it's sort of notable and interesting is not just the fact that Jikeli was not Jewish, but specifically that he was coming out of this German context where, like when I was in Germany reporting on this, you have these anti-Semitism commissioners in Germany who are largely non-Jewish and who are passing judgment often on what German Jews, Germany now has a fairly large community of like leftist Jews, some Israeli sort of expats who are very left-wing on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And you have these non-Jewish Germans passing these decrees that say, oh, this anti-Zionist protest full of Jews is anti-Semitic, and we're going to, throw everyone in the back of a police van or whatever. It's odd.
I shouldn't laugh. It's the irony.
Well,
yeah.
Right. But I don't think there is that sense of irony because I think there's a sense of confidence that like I am doing the right thing. People may not understand it, they may not get it, but I am doing the right and moral thing. And so, it's hard for me to put myself in Jikeli's shoes or the shoes of anyone trying to run a Jewish studies department. But one of the themes that came up was like it's a really hard time to run one of these departments. Many of them are quite politically diverse. You have students coming from different political backgrounds. You have people studying all different sorts of things. And, I think that might call for a degree of humility. And perhaps that degree of humility would be greater if you were yourself not Jewish. When I was I studied abroad at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. I took some classes in the African Studies department, which was run by a white guy at the time. And I think he was sort of aware that it was a little bit weird to be, I mean, obviously he was South African, he was African, but it was a little bit weird to be like a white guy studying a continent that is largely non-white. And there was a sensitivity to that. And there was a sense of like, I'm really going to lean on my colleagues who have a different background than me when I'm making controversial decisions. And so yeah, should Jewish studies departments be staffed and be directed based on people's, ethnic background or religious identity? No, I mean, I don't think that would be a terribly sound policy. But I would think that you would just, Jewish or not, want to be really careful about how you're approaching these things. And, I guess my final thought is that I just intuitively, emotionally, I get it a little bit more when a Jewish person has a really strong view on what is and isn't anti-Semitic, or on Israel, or on these other things. Because, we know it's like we have all this, trauma after the Holocaust. We have this fear of anti-Semitism. We have the emotional attachments to Israel, sometimes against Israel. But it's like it's really wrapped up in who we are and our identity. In the same way that I would understand if a German person had really strong views about the German state and, the German government, etc. And so it was striking and kind of odd to me that somebody who was not themselves Jewish would be so confident and so committed to a particular view of what it means to be Jewish, of what is offensive to Jews, etc. And the fact that there wouldn't be some sense of like, well, I have these views, that have been informed by my research or informed by my relationship with Jews, but now I'm running this department that has all different sorts of Jews. Let me go hear from them and understand their experience and perhaps modify mine, or figure out like what is the sort of like lowest common denominator that we can all agree on, and try not to push controversies beyond that. So I think that that's where it's most notable to me. But yeah, I wanted to be careful because I don't want to suggest, I took Jewish studies classes in college at the University of British Columbia, and there were Muslim students in the class and Christian students. And I thought to myself, this is so cool. I'm glad that other people want to learn about being Jewish. And if they were inspired to go into that field, I wouldn't want there to be some sense of like, well, you can only rise to this level and no further because you're not Jewish. Like, I don't think that that's the world that we're seeking to live in. But yeah, there were other things that made this seem like an unusual situation.
Arno Rosenfeld, thank you so much for your reporting on this, and thank you so very much for coming on The Jewish Angle to talk about it.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Jewish Angle, a podcast from the Canadian Jewish News. This has been Phoebe Maltz Bovy, opinion editor of the CJN and a contributing editor of Scribe Quarterly, the CJN's print magazine. The show is produced and edited by Michael Fraiman. Our music is by Frank Freeman. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to The Jewish Angle wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.